For my 40th birthday, my wife and kids threw a roast night. They laughed as my son read a list titled Dad's Biggest Failures. My daughter said, "Mom said you used to be someone." Her parents clapped. Even her boss stood up and said, "We all know who pays the bills." I smiled, said nothing, and left. The next day, their company emails bounced back, all under my domain name. My name's Marcus Reed, and let me tell you something about turning 40 that nobody puts on those cheesy Hallmark cards they sell at CVS. It's supposed to be a milestone, right? A moment of reflection, maybe some gratitude, perhaps a midlife crisis involving a leather jacket you'll never actually wear. What it's not supposed to be is a full-scale public execution disguised as a party. But hey, my, my loving wife Lydia has always had a flair for the dramatic. So I should have seen this coming from a mile away. She called it a roast night, which I initially thought meant we'd be eating some kind of fancy pot roast situation with those little potatoes I like. Maybe inviting a few close friends over for some wine and terrible dad jokes. Boy, was I wrong. Turns out roast in Lydia's vocabulary translates directly to let's gather everyone Marcus has ever supported financially and emotionally so they can take turns eviscerating his dignity while eating the 7-layer dip he paid for. The living room was packed. And I mean sardine can Subway at rush hour packed, with every single person who had ever taken a piece of my soul and filed it away in their Reasons Marcus's mediocre folder. My son Ryan, all 16 years of cocky teenage wisdom, stood up first with this crumpled piece of notebook paper that looked like he'd written it during third period chemistry. And the title alone should have made me walk out right then and there. Dad's Biggest Failures, a comprehensive list. I'm sitting there thinking, comprehensive? Kid, you're 16. You think Taco Bell is fine dining and you still can't figure out how to separate your whites from your colors in the laundry. But sure, let's hear your expert analysis on where dear old dad went wrong in life. He starts reading off this list like he's presenting evidence at trial, mentioning my failed side business from 8 years ago, which, for the record, wasn't a failure. It was a calculated exit strategy that netted me enough to pay for his braces and that gaming PC he just had to have, and my midlife crisis motorcycle that I allegedly sold after 2 weeks because I was too scared to ride it. The crowd's eating it up like it's premium Netflix content, and I'm just sitting there with my glass of wine thinking about how much therapy is going to cost this kid when he eventually realizes his father literally owns the infrastructure his entire digital life runs on. Then, my daughter Sophie, sweet 12-year-old Sophie, who I still tuck in sometimes when she pretends she's too grown up for it, delivers the line that honestly should have been my breaking point, but instead became my supervillain origin story. She giggles, and it's this mean girl giggle she definitely learned from her mother, and says with this practiced innocence that would make a Hollywood actress jealous, "Mom says you used to be someone. Used to be someone." Let that marinate for a second. This is coming from the kid whose entire existence I've funded, whose private school tuition costs more than most people's cars, whose bedroom looks like a Teen Vogue magazine exploded in there. And she's standing in front of 30 people telling me I used to be relevant in the past tense, like I'm some washed-up has-been celebrity desperately clinging to my 15 minutes. The room absolutely loses it. I'm talking wheezing laughter, people literally slapping their knees like we're at the Apollo Theater, and she just dropped the sickest burn in comedy history. But wait, it gets better. Because apparently this isn't just a family affair. No, Lydia decided to invite her entire social circle, including her parents Gerald and Beverly, who have treated me like a charity case they regret investing in since day one of our marriage. They're sitting there on my couch, the one I paid for, clapping like they're front row at a comedy club. Gerald's got tears streaming down his face from laughing so hard, and Beverly's clutching her pearls, but in that delighted way where she's clearly having the time of her life watching her son-in-law get verbally dismantled. These are the same people who, when Lydia and I got engaged 15 years ago, pulled me aside and told me I seemed nice, but maybe a bit too ambitious for someone with no family connections, which was their polite way of saying, I wasn't born with a silver spoon jammed so far up my backside that I could taste the hereditary privilege. And then, and then we reached the grand finale, the pièce de résistance of this humanitarian disaster. Lydia's boss, Mr. Richard Caldwell himself, stands up with his whiskey glass held high like he's about to deliver the Gettysburg Address. And this guy, this absolute legend of a human being who wouldn't know genuine work ethic if it filed his taxes for it, looks around the room with this shit-eating grin and declares, well, we all know who really pays the bills in this household. The place erupts. I mean, absolute pandemonium. People are high-fiving. Someone's recording it on their phone, probably to post on whatever social media platform makes you feel morally superior these days. And Lydia's laughing so hard she's snorting, which she only does when she thinks something is peak comedy gold. Everyone's looking at me, waiting for my reaction, expecting me to either defend myself or crumble or maybe flip a table like we're on one of those trashy reality shows she watches religiously. Instead, I just smiled. A real smile, too, not one of those forced grimaces you give when your dentist tells you that you need a root canal and it's going to cost your entire savings account. I raised my glass right back at Mr. Caldwell, looked him dead in his self-satisfied eyes, and said with the kind of calm that probably should have tipped them off that something was cosmically wrong with this picture. You're right, sir, we all know. And I let that hang there for a second, watching as the laughter continued, watching as my wife beamed with pride at her successful party, watching as my kids looked at me with something between pity and embarrassment, and watching as my in-laws exchanged that knowing glance that said, we always knew he was a pushover. Then I stood up, set my glass down on the coffee table with the kind of gentle precision that would make a bomb diffuser nervous, and I left. Just walked right out of my own birthday party without another word, without a dramatic speech, without throwing the cake at anyone's face, even though the temptation was strong enough to require physical restraint. No shouting, no breaking stuff, no Jerry Springer finale, just a quiet exit that probably confused them more than any tantrum would have. I could hear the party continue behind me as I grabbed my keys and headed out to my car, probably with someone cracking another joke about how I can't even handle a little roasting, how I'm too sensitive, how I need to learn to take a joke. Here's the thing about jokes, though. They're only funny when everyone's in on them. And what my loving family and their chorus of enablers didn't realize, what they couldn't possibly have known because I'd spent 15 years being deliberately, strategically humble about it, was that every single company represented in that room, every business card on that side table, every email address people were using to RSVP to this disaster, all of it ran through my holding firm's domain services. Reed Enterprises, a company I built from scratch while they all assumed I was just some boring tech guy who fixed printers or whatever stereotype they'd assigned me, owned the entire digital infrastructure that their precious careers depended on. The same domain services they used for their email addresses, their client communications, their invoices, their whole professional existence, all of it running through servers that I controlled with the kind of access that would make Mark Zuckerberg nervous. As I drove away from my house, watching it disappear in the rearview mirror with all its lights on and all its people laughing, I felt this weird sense of calm wash over me. Not anger, not hurt, just this crystal clear understanding that Monday morning was going to be absolutely educational for everyone involved. Because here's what they didn't teach you in business school. Being underestimated isn't a weakness. It's a weapon, and I'd just spent 15 years loading the chamber while everyone assumed the gun wasn't even real. They wanted to roast me? Fine. Let them have their laughs, their zingers, their moment of feeling superior. But come Monday morning, when their emails stopped working and their entire digital ecosystem came crashing down like a house of cards in a hurricane, they'd learn a valuable lesson about who really pays the bills around here. And the best part? I wouldn't have to say a single word. The error messages would do all the talking for me. Lydia and I had been married for 15 years, which in Hollywood terms is basically 3 lifetimes, but in suburban middle-class America, it's supposed to be this adorable milestone where you renew your vows or take a second honeymoon to some overpriced resort in the Bahamas where they charge you $17 for a watered-down margarita. Except our marriage wasn't built on love or passion or any of that soulmate garbage they sell you in romantic comedies. It was built on practicality, convenience, and the fact that when we met, I was the safe option her parents desperately wanted her to settle for after her previous boyfriend turned out to be a recreational pharmaceutical entrepreneur, which is a fancy way of saying he sold weed out of his Honda Civic. To Gerald and Beverly, I was the responsible choice, the guy with a startup dream and enough ambition to seem promising, but not so much success that I'd threaten their daughter's need to feel superior. So I was their project, They're fixer-upper, the human equivalent of buying a house in a decent neighborhood that needs some cosmetic work and a new roof. In the beginning, Lydia actually seemed interested in what I was building, asking questions about the business, pretending to understand when I explained server infrastructure and digital domain management, nodding along like she gave a damn about bandwidth optimization and client acquisition strategies. But somewhere between our wedding and the birth of our first kid, Ryan, I transformed in her eyes from ambitious entrepreneur to boring guy who used to be ambitious before kids ruined his potential. She loved saying this thing, usually at dinner parties or family gatherings where maximum humiliation could be achieved, where she'd tilt her head with this practiced sympathy and announce to whoever would listen, "You're so humble, it's almost pathetic, Marcus." And people would laugh because apparently self deprecating your spouse in public is peak comedy in suburban social circles. And I'd just smile and take another sip of whatever craft beer some investment banker brought over to prove he had taste, letting her have her moment because arguing would only make me look defensive and prove her point. Her parents, the illustrious Gerald and Beverly Morrison, treated me like I was some rescue project they'd regretted funding about 6 months into the investment. Gerald worked in commercial real estate, or at least he used to before he semi retired into playing golf 4 times a week and complaining about property taxes. And he had this way of looking at me during family dinners like I was a disappointing stock portfolio that never quite performed the way the projections promised. Beverly was worse, honestly, because she'd do this thing where she'd pat my hand sympathetically and say stuff like, "Well, at least you tried, Marcus." Whenever I mentioned anything about work, like trying was this adorable participation trophy you give to kids who come in last place at field day. They'd both voted against our marriage initially, I found out years later, telling Lydia I seemed unstable and too focused on unrealistic business ventures, which is rich coming from a guy who once invested 50 grand in a timeshare in Atlantic City and a woman who spent 3 years selling essential oils on Facebook before admitting it was a pyramid scheme. My son Ryan, bless his teenage heart, idolized exactly the kind of people you'd expect a 16-year-old with unlimited internet access and zero life experience to worship. YouTubers who screamed into cameras about cars they definitely rented for the video. Influencers who pretended their parents' money was actually their own entrepreneurial genius. And crypto bros who spoke in incomprehensible jargon about digital currencies, while conveniently never mentioning the fact that they still lived in their mom's basement. The kid had posters on his wall of guys with names like Turbo Trent and Cashflow Kevin, dudes who'd built their entire personalities around wearing Supreme hoodies and filming themselves doing absolutely nothing of value for 20-minute stretches. I'd tried, God knows I'd tried, to have actual conversations with Ryan about real business, about building something sustainable, about the difference between flash and substance, but he'd just look at me with those glazed over eyes kids get when their parents try to impart wisdom. And he'd say something like, "Dad, that's not how it works anymore," before going back to watching some 19-year-old explain why passive income is the only income that matters while actively begging people to smash that like button. Sophie, my 12-year-old daughter, existed in this weird bubble where money just magically appeared whenever she needed it, like some kind of financial tooth fairy situation. Except instead of losing teeth, she just had to exist and funds would materialize for whatever trending thing her friends had that she absolutely needed to survive middle school social hierarchy. She thought money grew in her mother's purse, literally, because Lydia had cultivated this image of being the breadwinner, the boss, the independent woman who didn't need her husband's income to maintain their lifestyle. Never mind that the purse was a $1,500 Prada bag I'd bought her for our anniversary, or that the money inside it came from the joint account that I funded entirely, or that her career consisted of a middle management position at a consulting firm that paid okay, but definitely didn't cover the private school tuition, the dance classes, the summer camps in places like Martha's Vineyard, where 12-year-olds learned to sailboat with trust fund kids named Chastity and Braden. I was the one paying for literally everything. The mortgage on our 4-bedroom colonial in the suburbs with the good school district, the car payments on Lydia's Range Rover that she needed because apparently a Toyota wasn't aligned with her personal brand, Ryan's gaming setup that cost more than my first car, Sophie's orthodontic work that seemed to require more gold than a rapper's mouth, and those absolutely ridiculous spa memberships Lydia called emotional maintenance, like getting a massage twice a week was somehow equivalent to actual therapy. I paid for Gerald's birthday dinners at steakhouses where he'd order the most expensive scotch on the menu and then complain about the service. For Beverly's random Amazon packages that showed up daily like she was personally keeping Jeff Bezos in space rocket money. For family vacations where I'd work from the hotel room while everyone else enjoyed the beach and then got mad at me for not being present. But it was fine, truly, genuinely fine, because I had learned a long time ago that being underestimated is the most profitable disguise you can wear in a world obsessed with peacocking and performance. While Lydia bragged to her book club about her career trajectory and her boss's mentorship and how she was really the glue holding our family together financially, I quietly managed a holding company that generated revenue streams she couldn't even conceptualize. While Gerald lectured me about getting serious about my career and maybe looking into real estate, because apparently that's where real money was made, I was diversifying investment portfolios and acquiring digital assets that would make his commercial property deals look like lemonade stand economics. While Beverly shared her Pinterest boards about budget friendly family dinners and helpful money saving tips, clearly directed at me with all the subtlety of a freight train, I was closing contracts with Fortune 500 companies who needed the exact services my firm provided. The thing about playing the long game is that you have to be comfortable with people thinking you're losing in the short term. And I'd gotten so comfortable with it that it became second nature. Let them think I was the boring husband who peaked in his 20s and never quite figured out how to level up. Let them believe Lydia was the superstar, and I was just the supportive, but ultimately forgettable background character in her success story. Let Ryan think his YouTuber heroes were the pinnacle of achievement, while his actual father was invisible. Let Sophie assume mom's purse was the source of all financial miracles. Let Gerald and Beverly maintain their fantasy that their daughter had married down and was heroically making the best of a mediocre situation. Because here's what they didn't understand. What they couldn't possibly grasp with their surface level assessment of success based on job titles and office sizes and who drove the flashier car to parent teacher conferences. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I didn't need the validation, the recognition, the public acknowledgement of my achievements. I'd built an empire so quietly that nobody even realized they were standing in it, and that invisibility was worth more than any amount of praise or respect they could offer. Being underestimated meant people underestimated what you were capable of. And when they finally realized their mistake, when the curtain pulled back and reality smacked them in their smug faces, the shock value alone was worth 15 years of playing the humble, harmless husband. So yeah, they could have their jokes and their superiority and their little moments of feeling like they'd figured out the pecking order of our family dynamics. They could pat themselves on the back for being married to the real provider, for having the successful daughter, for raising kids who knew their dad was basically just taking up space in the family photo. It was all good with me, because Monday morning was coming like a freight train they didn't even hear approaching. And when it hit, their entire understanding of who Marcus Reed actually was would shatter like cheap glass, and I'd be there to sweep up the pieces with a smile that said, "I told you so," without having to say a single word. The night before the roast, Lydia cornered me in our bedroom while I was trying to figure out what to wear to my own supposed birthday celebration, and she hit me with this absolute gem of passive-aggressive instruction disguised as helpful advice. Don't dress too formal, babe. It's casual. Now, in normal people speak, casual means jeans and a nice shirt, maybe those shoes that aren't quite sneakers but aren't dress shoes either. The ones that live in that weird middle ground of acceptable adult footwear. But in Lydia speak, which I'd become unfortunately fluent in after 15 years of marriage, this translated directly to, "We're planning to absolutely demolish you tonight, and you'll look like an overdressed idiot in all the photos if you show up wearing anything that suggests you have self-respect." She said it with that smile she does, the one that doesn't quite reach her eyes, and the one she uses when she's pretending to be helpful, but is actually setting up a trap that won't spring until you're already caught in it. I should have known something was cosmically wrong with the universe when even the kids started acting weird. And I'm not talking normal teenage weird or preteen weird. I'm talking full-on espionage level weird. Like they'd been recruited by the CIA and given a mission briefing on operational security. Ryan, who normally couldn't keep a secret if his life depended on it, who'd spoiled every Christmas present since he learned to talk by literally pointing at the wrapped boxes and announcing what was inside them, suddenly developed the information containment skills of a Cold War spy. Every time I walked into a room, he'd hide his phone with the kind of urgency usually reserved for hiding hardcore contraband, shoving it under couch cushions or flipping it face down on tables so fast you'd think he was watching something that would get him grounded until college. When I asked him what he was looking at, he'd get all defensive and weird, saying nothing in that tone that absolutely means something highly suspicious that you definitely should be concerned about. Sophie was even worse, honestly, because at least Ryan had the excuse of being a teenager with the emotional intelligence of a potato. But Sophie was usually my little ally, my partner in crime, the kid who'd tell me when mom was planning something insane or when grandma said something insulting that I wasn't supposed to hear. But that week leading up to my birthday, she transformed into this tiny prosecuting attorney, asking me the weirdest questions out of nowhere, like she was gathering evidence for a case she was building against me. One morning at breakfast, completely unprompted, she asked me how to spell irrelevant. And when I told her and asked why she needed to know, she just shrugged and said it was for a school project, which would have been believable, except it was summer break and she had no school projects, unless her teacher was assigning homework during vacation like some kind of educational sadist. Then she asked me what my biggest regret was, and when I gave her some sanitized answer about wishing I'd learned to play guitar or something equally harmless, she wrote it down in this little notebook she was carrying around like she was Barbara Walters preparing for a hard-hitting interview. The whole house felt like a conspiracy theory come to life, like I was living in one of those movies where everyone's acting normal, but there's ominous music playing in the background that only the audience can hear, warning them that something terrible is about to happen, and the protagonist is too oblivious to see it coming. Lydia was taking phone calls in the garage, which she never did because she usually loved having her conversations on speakerphone in the kitchen so everyone could hear how important and busy she was. Beverly came over 3 times that week, which was approximately 3 times more than usual since she typically preferred to summon us to her house rather than lowering herself to visit ours. And every time she showed up, she and Lydia would disappear into the study with the door closed, emerging 20 minutes later with these satisfied smirks like they'd just planned the heist of the century. Should have been a clue. Actually, it was a clue. It was approximately 17 different clues, all screaming, "Abort mission," in neon letters. But I ignored every single one of them because I wanted to believe that my family, despite all evidence to the contrary, actually gave enough of a damn about me to celebrate my birthday. Like normal humans, instead of treating it like an opportunity to roast me alive in front of everyone we knew. I'm an optimist, sue me. Or maybe I'm just an idiot. The jury's still out on that one, but I genuinely thought that maybe, just maybe, they were planning something nice, and all the secrecy was because they wanted it to be a genuine surprise, like a party with people I actually liked, or a gift that showed they'd paid attention to literally anything I'd mentioned wanting in the past decade. So, despite every instinct telling me to fake a business trip or come down with a sudden case of food poisoning that would require me to spend my birthday in bed watching Netflix and avoiding human contact, I still showed up with wine, gifts for the kids, even though it was my birthday because apparently I'm a glutton for punishment, and this absolutely delusional sense of optimism that would make Pollyanna look like a pessimist. I bought the expensive wine too, the kind that comes in bottles with fancy labels and costs more than most people spend on groceries because I figured if we're celebrating, we might as well do it right. And I grabbed some flowers for Lydia on the way home because, despite everything, I was raised to believe you bring your wife flowers on special occasions, even when the special occasion is your own birthday and she's probably planning your social execution. Walking into that house with my arms full of wine and flowers and wrapped presents, seeing all the cars parked on our street like we were hosting a block party, hearing the sound of conversation and laughter coming from inside, I had this moment, this brief, flickering moment, where I thought maybe I'd been wrong about everything. Maybe they actually did care. Maybe this was going to be a good night. That moment lasted approximately 4 seconds, which is how long it took me to walk through the front door and see the PowerPoint presentation queued up on our TV with the title slide reading, "Dad, a Tragic Story," in Comic Sans font, which is not only insulting, but also a crime against typography that should be punishable by law. That's when I knew. That's when every single weird interaction from the past week clicked into place like a jigsaw puzzle, revealing a picture of my own demise. And I realized that When your family says, "We planned a surprise for you," sometimes the surprise isn't a party or a gift or a heartfelt celebration of your existence. Sometimes the surprise is your own funeral conducted in joke format while you're still alive to experience it, like some twisted episode of a sitcom where the laugh track plays over your pain and everyone thinks it's hilarious except you. But by then it was too late to escape, too late to fake an emergency or pretend I forgot something at the office. Because everyone had seen me walk in, they were all turning to look at me with these expectant faces. And Lydia was already walking over with that smile that should have come with a hazard warning saying, "Happy birthday, honey," in a tone that basically meant, "Welcome to your execution. Hope you're ready to die." Ryan was standing by the TV with the remote control in one hand and that crumpled piece of paper in the other, looking way too excited for someone about to publicly eviscerate their own father. Sophie was sitting on the couch between her grandparents, practically vibrating with anticipation, like she was about to watch her favorite show. Gerald had positioned himself in the best seat in the house, with a drink already in hand, ready for the entertainment. Beverly was adjusting the lighting like she was directing a film, and Mr. Caldwell, Lydia's boss, that absolute legend of mediocrity, was holding court by the fireplace, already laughing at jokes that hadn't been told yet, warming up the crowd for the main event. I set down the wine and flowers on the entryway table, hung up my jacket like a man walking to his own hanging, and thought to myself with the kind of dark humor that only comes from knowing you're about to be publicly humiliated, well, at least I dressed casually, so when this all goes to hell and these pictures end up on Facebook, I won't look like I tried too hard. Small victories, you know? Sometimes that's all you get. The consolation prize of knowing that when your family roasts you into oblivion, at least your outfit was appropriately casual for the occasion. Lydia was right about one thing. I definitely shouldn't have overdressed for my own funeral. The roast started off innocent enough, or at least as innocent as publicly mocking someone can be, when you've gathered 30 of their closest friends, family members, and random acquaintances who probably just came for the free food and entertainment. There were the standard warm-up jokes, the kind of gentle ribbing that you'd expect at any normal family gathering where people pretend to like each other, a few cracks about my old hairline that had started its strategic retreat from my forehead around year 7 of our marriage, some commentary on my garage projects that apparently were hilarious failures, even though half of them still worked perfectly fine, and the obligatory roasting of my dad bod, which, for the record, I'd earned through years of stress eating while building a company that funded everyone's lifestyles. So maybe show some respect to the physique that paid for your organic groceries and hot yoga memberships. I was sitting there in what I thought was my safe space, my favorite recliner that had molded to my body shape over years of use, nursing a glass of that expensive wine I'd brought like an idiot, and thinking, okay, this isn't so bad, this is manageable. I can survive some light teasing about my hair and my weekend projects and the fact that I sometimes wear socks with sandals because comfort matters more than fashion when you hit 40. But then Lydia, my beloved wife of 15 years, the woman who promised to love and cherish me through sickness and health, and apparently also through public humiliation, decided it was time to kick this party into high gear by bringing out a slideshow, an actual professionally formatted PowerPoint presentation that she'd clearly spent more time on than our last 3 anniversary celebrations combined. The title slide flashed onto our 70-inch TV that I'd bought on Black Friday specifically so we could have family movie nights, and it read in bold letters that burned themselves into my retinas, Marcus through the years, from hopeful to helpless. She'd even included a subtitle that said "A Photographic Journey of Decline" with a little emoji of a man shrugging, because apparently even our digital communication symbols were in on the joke now. The room went absolutely silent for about half a second before erupting into this wave of anticipatory laughter, that specific kind of crowd noise that happens when people know they're about to witness something spectacularly awkward, and they're already priming themselves to find it hilarious before the punchline even lands. Lydia stood there with the remote control like she was Steve Jobs unveiling the iPhone, clicking through slides that she'd organized chronologically to show my supposed deterioration from promising young entrepreneur to whatever disappointing specimen I'd become in her eyes. There were pictures of me from our early dating days when I actually had a full head of hair and hadn't yet developed the permanent stress lines around my eyes, and captioned with things like "back when he had dreams" and "pre-mortgage Marcus." Still believed anything was possible. Then came the wedding photos with captions like, "She said yes, even though her parents said no," and "the beginning of the end," which honestly should have hurt more than it did, but I'd become so numb to her casual cruelty that it just kind of bounced off like I'd developed emotional Kevlar. The slides progressed through our marriage like a depressing flipbook, each image carefully selected to make me look as pathetic as possible. There was one of me attempting to fix our sink with the caption, "Thought he was handy, flooded the bathroom instead." Never mind that I did actually fix the sink and the flooding was minimal and cleaned up in like 10 minutes. There was a photo of me with that motorcycle I'd bought during what Lydia loved to call my midlife crisis phase, captioned, "Sold after 2 weeks because scary," completely ignoring the fact that I sold it because Sophie cried every time I left the house on it, thinking I was going to die in a fiery crash. And being a good father apparently meant being roasted for prioritizing my daughter's emotional well being over looking cool on a Harley. Ryan took the metaphorical stage next, standing up with that crumpled paper I'd seen him hiding all week. And the kid transformed into some kind of amateur stand up comedian, reading from his prepared remarks like he was delivering a TED talk on the subject of paternal disappointment. And his paper was titled Dad's Biggest Failures, a Comprehensive List. And I want you to understand that comprehensive was doing some heavy lifting in that title because this 16-year-old who couldn't even remember to take the trash out without being asked 17 times had apparently documented every single moment of my life that he deemed unworthy of respect. He started with bullet points, actual bullet points like this was a corporate presentation, beginning with failed side business, which referred to a tech consulting venture I'd run 8 years ago that actually turned a solid profit before I strategically folded it into my larger company. But sure, Ryan, let's call it a failure because it didn't get covered by TechCrunch or whatever metric of success you've decided matters. He moved through his list with this theatrical delivery that suggested he'd been practicing in the mirror, probably filming himself for his Instagram stories or whatever social media platform the kids were using to document their every thought these days. Midlife crisis motorcycle sold after 2 weeks made another appearance, because apparently that was just infinite comedy material for this family, followed by still wears flip-flops with jeans, which felt like a personal attack on my footwear choices that honestly didn't deserve this level of scrutiny, and thinks Facebook is still cool, which was just factually incorrect, because I never thought Facebook was cool. I just used it to stay connected with old college friends and occasionally share photos of family events that clearly nobody actually appreciated. The crowd was eating this up like Ryan was Dave Chappelle in his prime. People were literally wiping tears from their eyes, and I could see Gerald over on the couch absolutely losing his mind with laughter, slapping his knee repeatedly like he'd discovered the funniest thing that had ever been said in human history. Beverly was clutching her wine glass with both hands, her face red from laughing, and she kept looking over at me like she was checking to make sure I was witnessing my own destruction, like she wanted confirmation that I understood how hilarious everyone found my existence. Then Sophie delivered the knockout punch, the line that would haunt me for the rest of my natural life, the sentence that crystallized everything wrong with how this family viewed me into 8 perfect words. She stood up on the couch, literally stood up like she was giving a speech at a political rally. And with this practiced delivery that suggested Lydia had coached her multiple times to get the timing just right, she announced to the entire room in her sweet 12-year-old voice that somehow made it cut even deeper. Mom says you used to be someone, used to be someone. Past tense, historical, ancient history. Like I was some washed up former athlete who peaked in high school and spent the rest of my life reliving glory days that had long since faded into irrelevance. The room didn't just laugh, they exploded. We're talking absolute chaos. People doubled over, someone actually fell off their chair. Gerald was making this wheezing noise like he couldn't breathe, and Lydia was standing there, looking so proud of our daughter for landing that line, beaming like Sophie had just won a Pulitzer Prize for sick burns. Even Mr. Caldwell, who barely knew me beyond the occasional awkward interaction at company events Lydia dragged me to, was laughing so hard he had to set down his drink to avoid spilling it. And then, because apparently the universe decided I hadn't suffered enough, Caldwell himself decided to contribute his wisdom to this roast, standing up with his whiskey glass raised like he was the keynote speaker at a conference on my inadequacy. This man, this absolute titan of middle management, who'd built his entire career on taking credit for other people's work and schmoozing clients at golf courses, looked around the room with this conspiratorial grin and delivered his masterstroke. He's not useless, he's just outdated software. The metaphor landed perfectly with this crowd because it combined just enough tech terminology to sound clever while still being accessible enough for everyone to understand. And it painted me as some obsolete program that maybe worked fine back in Windows 95, but had no place in the modern world. My mother-in-law, Beverly, absolutely lost whatever remaining composure she'd been maintaining, screaming with laughter like she'd just witnessed the funniest moment in comedic history, tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking. She looked at Gerald and then at me and then back at Gerald like she couldn't believe this was really happening. Like Christmas had come early and that someone had given her the gift of watching her disappointing son-in-law get verbally dismantled in his own living room while eating his expensive cheese that he'd paid for. I just sat there through all of it, maintaining that smile I'd perfected over 15 years of being underestimated, that expression that said, I'm a good sport, I can take a joke, this is all in good fun, while internally calculating exactly how many domain licenses I was about to revoke come Monday morning. Because here's the thing about letting clowns perform. You have to let them finish their entire act. Let them take their bows, let them bask in the applause before you own the entire circus and shut down the show permanently. After the roast finally ended, after the last joke had been told, and the crowd had exhausted themselves laughing at my expense, and people started filtering toward the kitchen for more drinks and that 7-layer dip that was honestly the only victim-free casualty of the evening, Lydia came over to where I was still sitting in my recliner and patted my shoulder with this condescending tenderness that you'd use on a child who just lost their little league game. She leaned down, her wine breath hitting my face in a warm wave of Chardonnay and self-satisfaction, and said in this tone that was probably meant to be comforting but landed somewhere between patronizing and absolutely delusional. Don't take it personally, babe. It's humor. Everyone laughed. And she said it like the fact that everyone laughed somehow made it better. Like peer approval of my humiliation was supposed to transform emotional abuse into wholesome entertainment. Like I should be grateful that my public execution was at least well attended and enthusiastically received by the audience. Yeah, so did the audience on the Titanic before the ship cracked in half and everyone realized that maybe this wasn't going to be the pleasant voyage they'd signed up for. But I didn't say that out loud because engaging in an argument at this point would have been like trying to bail water out of a sinking ship with a teaspoon. Technically possible, but ultimately pointless and exhausting. Instead, I just nodded, gave her that same smile I'd been wearing all night, like a mask that had practically fused to my face, and said something non-committal like, yeah, it was something, which could mean literally anything, depending on interpretation, but satisfied her need for me to acknowledge the evening had happened. I excused myself after a few more minutes of making small talk with people who suddenly wanted to check if I was okay, which is that thing people do after they've thoroughly enjoyed watching you get torn apart. They perform this little ritual of concern to absolve themselves of guilt, like asking, you good, after laughing at every joke about your failures, somehow balances the cosmic scales of human decency. I told them all I was fine, just needed to use the bathroom, and I made my way upstairs while the party continued below me, the sound of conversation and laughter still echoing through the house like the soundtrack to my own personal nightmare. But I didn't go to the bathroom. Instead, I went straight to my home office, the one room in this entire house that was actually mine, that Lydia hadn't redecorated or claimed for her yoga sessions, or turned into a storage space for her endless online shopping deliveries. I closed the door, locked it for good measure, sat down at my desk with the city lights visible through the window behind me, and I opened my laptop, the secure one, not the family computer that everyone used to watch Netflix and accidentally download viruses because someone clicked on a suspicious link promising free gift cards. See, here's what nobody in that living room understood, what they couldn't possibly comprehend because I'd spent 15 years deliberately keeping this information locked down tighter than a classified government file. I wasn't unemployed. I wasn't some washed-up has-been desperately clinging to relevance. I wasn't outdated software that needed to be replaced and with a newer model. I was Marcus Reed, founder and CEO of Reed Enterprises, a tech infrastructure firm that specialized in digital domain management, server hosting, email systems, and basically the entire technological backbone that modern businesses relied on to function in the 21st century. We weren't some flashy startup that got written about in Forbes or some app that teenagers downloaded and forgot about. We were the invisible infrastructure, the foundation that nobody thinks about until it suddenly stops working. And here's the kicker, the absolute beautiful irony that I'd been sitting on for years like a poker player, holding a royal flush, while everyone else assumed I had nothing. Lydia's company, the consulting firm where she worked and bragged about her career and her boss's mentorship and her trajectory toward partnership, they rented their entire email domain for my company. Every single message she sent with that professional signature, every client communication, every internal memo, all of it ran through servers that I owned and controlled. The same was true for Caldwell's firm, the place where he strutted around acting like he was Gordon Gekko when really he was just another middle manager with a fancy title and an inflated sense of his own importance. For years, literal years, I'd kept that detail private, not because I was ashamed or hiding something, but because I learned early in our marriage that Lydia didn't handle my success well. Anytime I had a professional victory, closed a big contract, added a major client, she'd find a way to minimize it or make it about herself or get weirdly competitive, like we were in some kind of marriage Olympics where only one person could win. So I stopped telling her things. I stopped sharing the details of my business growth. I let her believe whatever narrative made her comfortable. And that narrative apparently involved me being this harmless, bumbling figure who was lucky she'd married him, because otherwise, who knows what would have happened to poor, pathetic Marcus. But sitting there in my office, listening to the party continue below me, with people probably still cracking jokes about my failures and inadequacies, something in me shifted. It wasn't anger exactly. Anger is hot and impulsive and makes you do stupid things you regret later. This was colder, more calculated. The kind of decision you make when you've been pushed to a line you didn't even know existed until someone shoved you across it. After being declared outdated software in my own house, at my own birthday party, in front of my own children, in a room full of people who owed their professional livelihoods to infrastructure I provided, I decided it was time for a system update. I pulled up the admin panel for Reed Enterprises, entered my credentials that only I had access to because I wasn't an idiot who shared passwords with family members who could barely remember their own Netflix login, and I navigated to the client management section. There they were, listed among hundreds of other businesses, Caldwell Consulting Group and Morrison and Associates, Lydia's firm that she'd been with for 7 years, climbing the ladder and building her reputation while I allegedly sat at home being irrelevant. Both companies had active contracts, both were paid up through the end of the year, both were completely dependent on my systems for their day-to-day operations. I looked at those account profiles for a long time, probably longer than necessary. But this wasn't the kind of decision you make impulsively, even when you're justified in making it. This was the kind of move that would have consequences, ripple effects, the kind of action you couldn't undo once it was done. But then, I heard laughter from downstairs, someone telling another story about something dumb I'd done, and I thought about Sophie saying, I used to be someone, like my relevance had expired years ago. And I thought about Ryan's list of my failures, and I thought about Lydia patting my shoulder and telling me not to take it personally, while 30 people digested the entertainment value of my humiliation. So I clicked on Caldwell Consulting Group's account first, navigated to their service settings, and I changed their status from active to suspended pending review. Then I did the same for Morrison and Associates. I didn't delete anything, didn't destroy data, didn't do anything that would actually harm anyone permanently. I just turned off the lights, locked the doors, and walked away from the building. Their emails would stop working, their client communications would bounce, their entire digital infrastructure would go dark like someone had pulled the plug on their professional existence. And the beautiful part, the absolutely poetic justice of it all, was that when they called tech support trying to figure out what happened, when they demanded answers about why everything stopped working, when they frantically searched for solutions to get their systems back online, every single help ticket would route directly to me because I was the administrator, the owner, the guy who controlled whether their businesses functioned or collapsed. I saved the changes, closed the laptop, and sat there in the darkness of my office for a few minutes, letting the weight of what I'd just done settle over me like a blanket. Tomorrow morning, well, technically Monday morning, because nobody checks their work email on Sunday if they can help it, was going to be absolutely educational for everyone involved. They wanted to roast me for being irrelevant? Fine. Let's see how relevant they felt when their entire professional infrastructure vanished and the only person who could restore it was the outdated software they'd spent an evening mocking. I went back downstairs, rejoined the party like nothing had happened, smiled through a few more conversations, thanked people for coming as they started to leave, and played the role of good natured husband and father who could take a joke and didn't hold grudges. And nobody suspected a thing because that's what I'd trained them to expect. Harmless Marcus, who takes his lumps and moves on, who doesn't make waves, who accepts his place in the family hierarchy without complaint. But Monday was coming like a freight train, and they were all standing on the tracks taking selfies, completely oblivious to what was about to hit them Sunday night after the last guest had finally left and the house was quiet except for the sound of Lydia loading the dishwasher while humming something that sounded suspiciously cheerful for someone who'd just orchestrated her husband's public humiliation. I packed a small bag with the essentials: laptop, charger, a few changes of clothes, my good headphones, and that book I'd been meaning to read for 6 months but never had time for because apparently being everyone's ATM is a full-time job. I moved quietly, methodically, like I was defusing a bomb rather than just gathering some shirts and toiletries because the last thing I needed was Lydia asking questions about why I was packing or where I was going or whether this was some kind of dramatic statement about my hurt feelings. I left a note on the kitchen counter right next to the coffee maker where I knew she'd see it first thing in the morning because Lydia's relationship with caffeine was more committed than her relationship with me. The note was simple, just 7 words that somehow contained 15 years of repressed feelings and accumulated disappointment. Thanks for the laughs. Gone for a while. No explanation, no forwarding address, no emotional manifesto about how they'd hurt me or crossed a line or made me feel small. Just a casual acknowledgement that something had shifted, delivered with the same energy as someone leaving a tip at a restaurant for mediocre service. I drove downtown to the Regency Suites, this boutique hotel that catered to business travelers and people having affairs and apparently middle-aged men experiencing delayed emotional breakdowns after being roasted by their own families. The night receptionist didn't even blink when I checked in at 11:30 on a Sunday night with just a duffel bag and a laptop case. Probably because she'd seen weirder things during the late shift than a guy escaping his own life for a few days. My room was on the 14th floor with a view of the city that was actually pretty decent, if you ignored the fact that I was looking at it alone while my family slept peacefully in the house I paid for, probably not even noticing I was gone yet. I didn't sleep much that night, partially because hotel beds are always either too soft or too hard, and never quite right, no matter how many stars the place has, but mostly because I was watching the clock tick toward Monday morning like a kid on Christmas Eve, except instead of presents, I was anticipating corporate chaos. I'd set everything to trigger at 8 a.m. sharp, right when people typically started logging into their systems, checking their emails, preparing for their weeks, completely unaware that their entire digital infrastructure was about to vanish like it had been snapped away by Thanos wearing a business suit. My phone started blowing up at exactly 8:15, which meant people had tried logging in, failed, tried again thinking maybe they'd typed their password wrong, failed again, started panicking, and then began the desperate reach out phase where they contacted anyone who might have answers. Lydia called first, which made sense because she was always the earliest riser in our house, the type of person who genuinely believed that waking up at 6 a.m. made you morally superior to people who enjoyed sleeping until a reasonable hour. I was sitting at the hotel room desk with my coffee, pretty decent coffee actually, way better than the Keurig situation we had at home, and I just watched her name flash on my screen, letting it ring through to voicemail because I wasn't quite ready for that conversation yet. She called again immediately, because Lydia's generation still believed that if someone didn't answer the first time, the solution was to call repeatedly until they did, like persistence, would somehow change the outcome. This time I answered, putting on my most casual voice like I was just hanging out having a normal Monday morning and definitely hadn't systematically shut down her entire company's digital infrastructure 12 hours earlier. "Hey, what's up?" I said, and I could hear the barely contained panic in her voice when she responded. That specific tone people get when their professional life is actively falling apart and they're trying to maintain composure. "Marcus, my email's not working, like at all, and apparently everyone at the company is locked out of their accounts. ET says the entire domain is down." She paused, waiting for me to jump in with some kind of explanation or solution, but I just took another sip of my coffee and let the silence hang there for a few seconds longer than was comfortable. Did you did you do something with the server? I thought you renewed the contract last month. We're running maintenance. I said, keeping my tone professional and detached, like I was customer service reading from a script rather than her husband of 15 years who'd just pulled the plug on her career. Expected downtime is indefinite pending technical review. I could practically hear her brain trying to process what indefinite meant in this context, trying to figure out if this was a legitimate technical issue or something else entirely, but not quite connecting the dots yet because, in her mind, I was harmless Marcus, who didn't make waves or cause problems or have the capability to do something this catastrophic. Then her boss Caldwell started texting me, which was bold, considering we'd never actually texted before. And I wasn't even sure how he had my personal number until I remembered that Lydia probably gave it to him at some point for emergency contacts or whatever reason she justified sharing my information with her workplace. His message was even more panicked than Lydia's call. Marcus, everything's down. Clients can't reach us. We can't send invoices. This is a disaster. Did you renew the server contract? What's the ETA on fixing this? I replied with the kind of calm, professional response that I knew would drive him absolutely insane. We're running maintenance on all Reed Enterprises systems. Expected downtime? Indefinite. For service restoration inquiries, please contact our customer service department during normal business hours, Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Pacific time. I even included the customer service email address, which was basically just me with a different email signature, but he didn't need to know that yet. By 9 a.m., my phone had turned into a war zone of notifications, calls, texts, voicemails, emails from people who managed to reach me through alternate addresses, even a few LinkedIn messages from Caldwell's staff who were apparently so desperate they'd resorted to social media as a communication platform. The general theme was panic mixed with confusion, mixed with this underlying assumption that surely this was just some technical glitch, some accidental oversight, something that would be resolved quickly once the right person got involved and fixed whatever mundane problem had caused this disruption. But by noon, the tone started shifting. The panic evolved into something closer to realization, that dawning horror, when you start to suspect that maybe this isn't an accident. Maybe someone did this deliberately. Maybe the harmless IT guy you'd been mocking at a party 2 days ago actually had the power to destroy your professional life with a few mouse clicks. Caldwell called me directly, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage, and demanded to know what was going on, why the systems were down, when they'd be restored, and whether I understood the financial implications of keeping a consulting firm offline during business hours. Mr. Caldwell, I said, and I made sure to use his formal title, even though he'd never extended me the same courtesy, always calling me Marcus or Lydia's husband, like I didn't have my own identity separate from my relationship to his employee. As I mentioned in my previous communication, Reed Enterprises is conducting comprehensive system maintenance. All client accounts under the Caldwell Consults domain are currently suspended pending review of service agreements and payment structures. For detailed information about service restoration timelines and associated fees, I'd recommend reaching out to our legal department. The silence on the other end of the line was so profound I actually checked my phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then he found his voice again, and it had this quality to it that suggested he was finally starting to understand what was happening here. Marcus, are you telling me that you own our domain? That you control our email infrastructure? I'm telling you that CaldwellConsults.com is registered under Reed Enterprises and has been since you signed the service agreement 6 years ago, I replied, keeping my voice steady and professional like we were discussing the weather rather than the complete collapse of his business operations. All email services, server hosting, and digital infrastructure management for your firm runs through my company. It's all in the contract you signed. Section 4, Paragraph 7, if you'd like to review the specific language. Every single account under the Caldwell Consults domain was bouncing back with one beautiful, simple message that I'd programmed to appear whenever anyone tried to send or receive email. This domain is no longer available. For service inquiries, contact Reed Enterprises. It was the most satisfying Error 404 of my entire life. Watching in real time, as their digital presence just evaporated like it had never existed, like someone had erased them from the internet with the efficiency of a professional hitman. Except instead of bullets, I'd used administrative access and a really thorough understanding of domain registration protocols. The best part, the absolutely chef's kiss moment of this entire Monday morning apocalypse, was watching the chaos unfold on social media. Because, of course, people were posting about it. We live in an age where if something isn't documented online, did it even really happen? Caldwell's clients started tagging the company in posts asking why their emails were bouncing, why they couldn't reach anyone, whether the firm was still operational or had suddenly gone out of business over the weekend. Someone started a hashtag Caldwell crash, which gained traction way faster than it should have, because apparently people love watching corporate disasters unfold in real time. And then someone else coined hashtag Servergate, which was less creative, but more descriptive of what was actually happening. By 3 p.m., I'd received 3 separate offers from Caldwell's competitors, wanting to buy the domain at triple what he'd been paying annually. Because in the business world, one company's catastrophic failure is another company's opportunity for expansion. And apparently several firms had been waiting for Caldwell to stumble so they could swoop in and absorb his client base. I politely declined all 3 offers, not because I needed the money, but because this wasn't about profit. This was about principle, about showing a room full of people who'd laughed at my expense that the outdated software they'd mocked actually ran the entire system they depended on. Sometimes revenge doesn't need fireworks or dramatic confrontations or elaborate schemes that take months to execute. Sometimes it just needs Wi-Fi access, administrative privileges, and the patience to wait 15 years for exactly the right moment to pull the plug and watch everything burn while you sip coffee in a hotel room and finally feel like someone who matters. By Tuesday morning, Lydia had escalated from phone calls to showing up at my hotel lobby wearing oversized sunglasses like she was a celebrity trying to avoid paparazzi, which was hilarious, considering the only people who recognized her were the hotel staff who probably thought she was some drama-prone wife checking up on her cheating husband, rather than a woman whose entire professional life had imploded because she'd underestimated the guy who'd been paying her bills for 15 years. She spotted me sitting in one of those lobby chairs that are designed to look comfortable, but actually aren't, reading my book and drinking what was probably my 4th coffee of the morning, because the Regency Suites had one of those fancy espresso machines that made me feel like I was living in a European cafe instead of hiding from my family in downtown accommodation. She power walked over to my table with that specific stride she used when she was trying to project authority and control in situations where she had absolutely neither. And she yanked off her sunglasses with the dramatic flair of someone who'd watched too many Real Housewives episodes and thought that's how confrontations worked in real life. "Marcus, you can't just shut down an entire company," she hissed, keeping her voice low because even in her panic, she was still conscious of making a scene in public, still worried about what strangers might think if they overheard our marital dysfunction on full display. And I looked up from my book, a thriller about corporate espionage that was significantly less interesting than the corporate espionage I was currently living through, and gave her the kind of calm smile that I knew would drive her absolutely insane because it suggested I was completely unbothered by her distress. "Of course I can," I said simply, marking my page and setting the book down on the table like we had all the time in the world to discuss this. "I own it." I took another sip of my coffee, letting those 3 words hang in the air between us like a grenade with the pin pulled, just waiting for her to fully process what I'd just said. She blinked at me, her perfectly applied makeup not quite hiding the bags under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept well since the email apocalypse began. And I watched her face cycle through several emotions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, anger, and then finally a creeping realization that maybe she didn't know her husband as well as she thought she did. "You what?" she said, and her voice had gone up about an octave, that thing that happens when people are trying to process information that doesn't fit with their understanding of reality. "Check the registration," I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms in a posture that I knew looked relaxed, but was actually just me physically preventing myself from saying something I'd regret later. Because despite everything, despite the roast and the humiliation and the years of being treated like a supporting character in someone else's story, I didn't actually want to completely destroy Lydia. I just wanted her to understand that actions have consequences and underestimating people is a dangerous game to play. Readenterprises.io. Remember that contract you signed without reading 3 years ago when your company switched service providers? That was the licensing deal. I'm not just some vendor they hired. I'm the vendor, the only vendor, the guy who owns the entire infrastructure their business runs on. Her face turned pale, that specific shade of white people get when they realize they've made a catastrophic mistake and there's no easy way to undo it. Like when you accidentally send an email to the wrong person or realize you've been talking trash about someone who is standing right behind you the entire time. I offered her a muffin from the plate the waitress had brought over, holding it out like a peace offering, even though we both knew there was no peace happening here. Carbs help with shock, I said. And I wasn't even being sarcastic. It was genuine advice because she looked like she might actually pass out right there in the hotel lobby. She didn't take the muffin. Instead, she sank into the chair across from me without asking if she could sit down, her designer purse, the Prada one I'd bought her for our anniversary naturally, dropping to the floor beside her like she'd forgotten it existed. Marcus, this is insane. You're punishing hundreds of people because of a stupid party? Because of some jokes? Caldwell has clients, employees, people with families who depend on those jobs. My company has obligations, contracts, deadlines. You can't just turn everything off because your feelings got hurt. And there it was, the inevitable minimization of what had happened, reducing a carefully orchestrated public humiliation to some jokes and my justified response to an emotional overreaction because my feelings got hurt, like I was a child throwing a tantrum over not getting dessert. This is what Lydia did, what she'd always done. Reframe situations so that she was the reasonable one, and anyone who reacted to her behavior was being dramatic or overly sensitive or somehow morally inferior for not just taking whatever she dished out with a smile and a thank you. You're right, I said, and I watched her face light up for just a second, thinking I was about to back down, about to be the same old Marcus who always caved, who always prioritized everyone else's comfort over his own dignity. Hundreds of people are affected. People with families and mortgages and real lives that don't revolve around mocking their spouses at birthday parties. Maybe Caldwell should have thought about that before he stood up in my living room and told everyone that he knows who really pays the bills, implying that I'm some kind of financial deadweight when in reality his entire company exists on infrastructure that I built and maintain. Meanwhile, social media was having an absolute field day with the whole situation because apparently corporate meltdowns are premium entertainment when you're not the one experiencing them. The Caldwell Crash hashtag had evolved from a few confused client posts into this whole phenomenon where people were sharing stories about their own terrible bosses and workplace humiliations, turning Caldwell into this symbol of corporate arrogance, getting its comeuppance. Someone had made a meme using that "this is fine" dog sitting in a burning room, except they'd photoshopped Caldwell's face onto the dog and captioned it, "When you roast the 8 guy who owns your domain." And it had gotten like 50,000 shares in 24 hours. Servergate was trending locally, with business reporters from the city's second-tier publications reaching out for comment, trying to understand what had caused this sudden infrastructure collapse and whether it represented a larger trend in corporate cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And one particularly ambitious journalist from a tech blog had done some actual investigative work and discovered that Reed Enterprises controlled domains for approximately 40% of mid-sized consulting firms in the metropolitan area, which meant if I wanted to, I could theoretically cause a regional business apocalypse just by clicking a few buttons. The article was titled, "The Man Behind the Curtain: How One Tech Entrepreneur Controls Your Company's Digital Life and You Didn't Even Know It." And while it was slightly sensationalized, it wasn't entirely inaccurate. By Tuesday afternoon, I'd received not 3 but 7 offers from various companies wanting to either buy Caldwell's domain, acquire his client list, or hire away his staff members who were presumably updating their LinkedIn profiles and sending out resumes, because nobody wants to work for a company that can't send emails. One offer came from Morrison and Associates, Lydia's firm, which was particularly ironic considering they were also locked out of their own systems and apparently didn't realize that the same guy who'd shut down Caldwell had also shut down them. Their HR director sent me this very professional email from his personal Gmail account asking if I'd be interested in discussing partnership opportunities and whether Reed Enterprises might consider preferential service restoration for their organization. Completely oblivious to the fact that I was married to one of their senior consultants and had very specific reasons for suspending their service. I forwarded that email to Lydia without comment, just hit the forward button, and sent it to her personal email since her work email was obviously non-functional. And I watched her face as she read it on her phone, watched the realization dawn that her company was just as screwed as Caldwell's, that this wasn't just about her boss's humiliation, but about the entire ecosystem of companies that had treated me like I was irrelevant while simultaneously depending on my work to function. They don't even know, do they? She said quietly, looking up from her phone with something that might have been respect or might have been fear. I honestly couldn't tell. Your company handles our infrastructure too. Morrison and Associates, we're locked out just like Caldwell. Yep, I said, popping the P sound in a way that probably made me seem more pleased with myself than I should have been. But honestly, after years of being the invisible man who fixed problems and enabled success without ever getting credit for it, I was entitled to a little bit of smugness. Have been for 4 years, ever since you guys did that digital transformation initiative and switched everything to cloud-based services. Remember how smooth that transition was? How everything just worked perfectly and your IT director got all that praise for managing such a seamless migration? That was me, my company, my team. We did all the back-end work while your guy took the credit and the bonus. Lydia was quiet for a long time, staring at her phone like it might suddenly provide answers or solutions or a time machine that would let her go back to Saturday night and maybe not throw a roast that would ultimately destroy multiple companies and her marriage. The lobby was filling up with business travelers checking out, rolling their expensive luggage toward the doors, probably heading to airports or meetings or anywhere that wasn't here, dealing with the consequences of underestimating the quiet guy who'd been holding everything together behind the scenes. So what happens now? She finally asked, and her voice had lost all that aggressive energy from when she'd first walked in, replaced by something that sounded almost like humility, though with Lydia it was hard to tell if emotions were genuine or just strategic performances designed to get what she wanted. You just keep everything shut down, watch it all burn, prove your point while people lose their jobs and clients sue for breach of contract and everything falls apart. I finished my coffee, set the cup down with that satisfying clink of ceramic on ceramic, and met her eyes with the kind of direct gaze that I'd been avoiding for years because looking directly at her meant seeing how little she respected me. And that was easier to ignore when I wasn't paying attention. What happens now, I said slowly, is that everyone learns a valuable lesson about respecting the infrastructure that enables their success. And maybe, just maybe, they'll think twice before publicly humiliating the person who's been holding everything together while they took all the credit. 2 days later, on Thursday morning, I showed up to the Caldwell Consulting emergency meeting that I'd been formally invited to via a desperate overnight FedEx letter. Yes, an actual physical letter, because apparently when your entire digital communication system is down, you rediscover the postal service like it's some ancient technology from a forgotten civilization. The letter was written on Caldwell's personal letterhead, which was pretentious even by executive standards, and it contained language that vacillated between formal business politeness and barely disguised panic, requesting my presence at a critical stakeholder meeting to discuss service restoration and ongoing partnership opportunities. Translation: please come to our office so we can beg you to turn our company back on before we lose everything and have to declare bankruptcy while our competitors laugh at us on LinkedIn. I wore my best suit, the charcoal gray Tom Ford that I'd bought 2 years ago for a tech conference and never actually wore because Lydia said it made me look too corporate, and she preferred when I dressed more casually, which I now understood meant she preferred when I looked less successful than her. I paired it with Italian leather shoes that cost more than most people's monthly car payments, a watch that had actual complications and not just the ability to tell time. And I walked into that conference room at Caldwell Consulting like I owned the place, which in a very real and legally binding sense, I kind of did, since without my infrastructure, they were basically just a bunch of people sitting in an expensive office space with fancy furniture and no way to conduct actual business. The conference room was packed, and not just with Caldwell and his executive team, but also with people I recognized from LinkedIn profiles and industry events. Their legal counsel, their CFO, a crisis management consultant they'd apparently hired at premium rates to fix a crisis that couldn't be fixed by anyone except me, and sitting in the corner looking like she'd rather be literally anywhere else, Lydia, who had been summoned to this meeting in her capacity as senior consultant. even though we both knew she was really there because Caldwell thought having my wife present might somehow soften my position or appeal to whatever marital loyalty he assumed still existed. Caldwell stood up when I entered, and the movement was so sudden it was almost comical, like I was some visiting dignitary or mob boss whose presence commanded immediate physical respect. He looked like he hadn't slept since Monday, which was probably accurate given that his entire business had been in free fall for 4 days, and social media was still having a party at his expense with new memes appearing daily about corporate hubris and karmic justice. Mr. Reed, he said, and the fact that he was suddenly using my surname with the formal prefix after years of just calling me Marcus or Lydia's husband would have been satisfying if it wasn't so predictable. People only remember your name when they need something from you. I took my time sitting down, pulling out the chair at the head of the table, even though that was technically Caldwell's spot. And nobody said anything about it because the power dynamics in this room had shifted so dramatically that traditional corporate hierarchy was basically meaningless now. I set my briefcase on the table, a leather Mont Blanc that I'd bought myself last year as a birthday present since nobody else was going to acknowledge my achievements, and I pulled out a folder containing contracts, domain registration documents, and a detailed breakdown of every service Reed Enterprises provided to Caldwell Consulting, and along with the exact terms he'd agreed to 6 years ago when he'd signed the service agreement without reading it because he was too busy being important to worry about details like who actually controlled his company's digital infrastructure. Mr. Reed, we need to negotiate, Caldwell said, diving straight into it without pleasantries or small talk. Because when your business is hemorrhaging clients and your phone is ringing nonstop with angry partners demanding to know why they can't access their files, you don't have time for social niceties. His hands were clasped in front of him on the table, and I noticed his knuckles were white from the pressure, that telltale sign of someone trying to maintain composure when everything inside them is screaming panic. I smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who's been underestimated for so long that finally being recognized feels better than it probably should. Negotiate? I said, letting the word hang there like I was testing its weight, considering its merit. No, I don't think negotiation is what's needed here, but I am open to acquisition. I slid the papers across the table toward him, watching his face as he tried to process what I just said, watching the exact moment when the words registered and their meaning became clear. He blinked, his eyes darting from the documents to my face and back again, like he was watching a tennis match played at high speed. You're buying us? The question came out strangled, confused, like I just suggested we all strip naked and perform interpretive dance instead of having a business meeting. Already did, I said, and I pulled out another document from my briefcase with the kind of casual confidence that comes from knowing you're holding all the cards and the other players are sitting there with nothing but a pair of twos and desperate hope. I slid the signed acquisition papers across the table, documents I'd finalized yesterday with my lawyers who'd been absolutely delighted to put together such a quick turnaround on what they called the most satisfying hostile takeover they'd ever facilitated. The papers were legal, binding, and ironclad. I'd purchased Caldwell Consulting Group for approximately 60% of its market value, which sounds generous until you realize that a company with no functioning email system or digital infrastructure loses about 40% of its value within the first week of catastrophic system failure, making my offer technically at market, even if it felt like a lowball to everyone in this room. Lydia's face had gone completely white, that bloodless, pale color that happens when people experience genuine shock. Not the performative kind, but the real body goes into emergency mode kind. She was staring at me like she'd never actually seen me before. Like the person sitting at the head of this conference table was a complete stranger wearing her husband's face. You can't do this, she said, and her voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the sound of Caldwell's legal counsel frantically flipping through the acquisition documents trying to find some loophole or technicality that would invalidate the sale. Actually, I said, turning to look at her directly for the first time since I'd entered the room, maintaining eye contact with the kind of steady gaze that communicated I wasn't backing down or second guessing or feeling even a little bit uncertain about what I'd done. I can. You roasted me for being useless, for being outdated software, for being someone who used to be relevant back in the prehistoric days before I became whatever disappointing thing you've decided I am now. So now I own the company you've spent years bragging about working for. I own Caldwell's ego project. I own every client contract, every piece of intellectual property, every pending deal that's been sitting in limbo since Monday when the email stopped working. The silence that followed was so pure, so absolute, that you could have bottled it and sold it to meditation retreats as the physical manifestation of stunned disbelief. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The crisis management consultant looked like she was reconsidering her career choices, probably wondering if her retainer was high enough to deal with this level of corporate drama. The CFO was reading through the acquisition papers with increasing horror, realizing that everything I was saying was legally accurate. And there was no technicality to exploit, no escape clause to invoke, no way to undo what had already been done. Caldwell finally found his voice, and it came out raw, defeated, stripped of all that artificial confidence he usually wore like cologne. What do you want, Marcus? Name your price. I'll buy the company back. Whatever you paid plus 20%, 30%, whatever it takes. This is my life's work. You can't just what? I interrupted, and my voice wasn't loud, but it cut through his pleading like a knife through warm butter. Can't just take over a company after being publicly humiliated by its CEO? Can't just exercise my legal rights as a service provider and business owner? Can't just make strategic acquisitions in my industry? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and I looked directly at Caldwell with the kind of intensity that made him physically lean back in his chair. You stood in my living room, in my house at my birthday party, and you told everyone that you know who really pays the bills, implying that I'm some kind of kept man, some irrelevant spouse riding on my wife's coattails. So yeah, I can just do this. In fact, I already did. The meeting continued for another hour, but it was essentially theater at that point. Legal counsel asking questions they already knew the answers to, executives trying to negotiate terms that had already been finalized, Caldwell making increasingly desperate appeals to my sense of fairness or mercy or basic human decency, none of which were particularly compelling after spending 15 years being treated like furniture that occasionally needed dusting. I laid out my plans for the company, rebranding, restructuring, bringing in new management, probably firing about 40% of the current executive team, including Caldwell himself, who would be offered a generous severance package in exchange for a non-compete agreement and his immediate resignation. Lydia tried to approach me after the meeting ended, catching my arm as I was leaving the conference room, her grip tight enough to communicate urgency but not quite desperate enough to cause a scene. "We need to talk," she said. And I could see she'd been crying at some point, her mascara slightly smudged despite obvious attempts to fix it, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. "About us. About what this means for our marriage." I gently removed her hand from my arm, not aggressively but firmly enough to make my point clear. "What this means for our marriage," I said quietly enough that the other people filing out of the conference room couldn't hear us, "is that maybe you should have thought about that before you organized a party specifically designed to humiliate me in front of everyone we know. Maybe you should have considered consequences before you let our children participate in listing my failures like it was a school presentation. Maybe you should have asked yourself if treating your husband like he's worthless might eventually result in him deciding to show you exactly how much worth he actually has. For the first time in 15 years of marriage, possibly for the first time since we'd met at that college party where I was the nerdy engineering student and she was the business major who thought I had potential, Lydia had absolutely nothing to say. She just stood there watching me walk away, probably finally understanding that the man she'd married, the man she'd systematically diminished and dismissed and diminished some more, had been playing a completely different game than she'd realized, and she'd just lost spectacularly without even knowing she was competing. As I walked out of Caldwell Consulting, soon to be renamed, rebranded, and rebuilt in my image, I felt no anger, no residual resentment, no burning desire for continued revenge. Just this profound sense of poetic justice wrapped in legal contracts and signed acquisition papers, tied up with a bow made of domain registrations and infrastructure control. Sometimes the best victories aren't the loud ones with dramatic confrontations and explosive arguments. Sometimes they're quiet, calculated, and executed with such precision that by the time people realize what happened, it's already over and there's nothing left to do except accept the new reality. Owning Caldwell's company wasn't the end of anything, it was just the beginning. The opening chapter of a story I should have started writing years ago instead of letting other people draft my narrative for me. I rebranded the firm within 2 weeks, dropping the pretentious Caldwell Consulting Group name that always sounded like it was trying too hard to impress country club members, and renaming it Cobalt Strategies, which was clean, modern, and didn't carry the baggage of a CEO who thought roasting his employee's husband was peak entertainment. The rebrand came with a complete philosophical overhaul. We'd focus on ethical tech management, transparent pricing structures, and actually treating employees like human beings instead of disposable resources that could be replaced whenever quarterly profits dipped. I promoted 2 employees that Lydia had always ignored, women who'd been doing exceptional work for years but kept getting passed over for advancement because they didn't play the office politics game, or laugh at Caldwell's jokes, or pretend that working 80-hour weeks was some badge of honor instead of a symptom of terrible management. Jennifer became our new VP of operations, and Sarah took over client relations, and within a month, our employee satisfaction scores went up 40%, and our client retention actually improved despite the chaotic transition, probably because people appreciated working with a company that valued competence over ego. Meanwhile, Lydia filed for separation, which was inevitable once she realized I wasn't going to apologize or restore her company's systems or pretend that everything could go back to normal after she'd orchestrated my public humiliation. Her parents called it a betrayal, which was rich coming from Gerald and Beverly, who'd spent 15 years treating me like their personal disappointment project. But apparently, when consequences finally showed up to the party, suddenly I was the villain for not just taking my lumps and moving on like a good little doormat. Ryan tried calling a few times, leaving these half-hearted voicemails that started with, "Dad, we should talk," and ended with awkward silences where he clearly didn't know what to say, because apologizing would require acknowledging he'd participated in something cruel. And 16-year-olds aren't great at that level of self-reflection. Sophie sent a text, though, and it was short, but it gutted me in the best possible way. "Mom's mad, but I think what you did was kind of badass." I laughed out loud when I read it, sitting in my new office with the view of the city skyline, and I texted back, "Kinda?" with a laughing emoji, because if my 12-year-old daughter thought corporate revenge was only kind of badass, then I clearly needed to up my game. It felt good to rebuild something real, not just a business, but a life, a sense of self-respect, an understanding that being underestimated wasn't a character flaw, but had actually been a strategic advantage that had paid compound interest over 15 years of careful planning and patient waiting for exactly the right moment to reveal who I actually was underneath all that harmless humility. A year later, on my 41st birthday, I hosted a quiet dinner at my downtown loft with close friends and my new partner, Elena, a cybersecurity consultant who actually respected what I did for a living and thought building infrastructure companies was genuinely interesting, instead of something to tolerate or mock at parties. No roasts, no failure lists, no PowerPoint presentations documenting my supposed decline from relevance. Just real laughter. The good kind that comes from genuine affection rather than schadenfreude. The kind that makes you feel lighter instead of smaller. My old in-laws, Gerald and Beverly, had gotten divorced 6 months after everything imploded. Apparently because once they lost their common enemy, me, the disappointing son-in-law, they realized they actually couldn't stand each other and had been using criticism of my life choices as the primary glue holding their marriage together. Caldwell Consulting was gone, completely absorbed into Cobalt Strategies, which was now being featured in business journals as an example of ethical tech management done right. Caldwell himself had moved to Arizona to pursue other opportunities, which was code for running away from the city where everyone knew him as the guy who roasted the wrong person and lost everything. Lydia had moved back in with her newly single mother, Beverly, working freelance consulting gigs that paid a fraction of what she used to make, probably finally understanding what financial instability actually felt like when you didn't have a husband quietly funding your lifestyle while you bragged about being independent. Ryan had apologized properly, like actually called me and had a real conversation about how he'd been a jerk and didn't understand the consequences of public humiliation, which was mature enough that I forgave him and started having regular dinners together where we talked about real things instead of just existing in the same house. Me? Son, I was on the cover of Tech Innovators Weekly with a headline that made everything worth it. The man who smiled at his roast and bought the room. The article detailed how the disrespected husband everyone had mocked turned out to be the backbone of their entire professional empire, controlling infrastructure for dozens of companies while maintaining perfect humility until the exact right moment to reveal his hand. As I raised my glass that night, surrounded by people who actually valued me, I said, to upgrades and to deleting useless files. Everyone laughed and clinked glasses. This time, the joke was on my terms, and that made all the difference in the world.